Oh yeah. Oh yeah, I'm doing the trash compactor. Where are all my Star Wars Connect Weebos at? Is that how you say that? I look like an idiot. Okay, so today we're going to talk about something that's been on my mind probably for, I don't know, weeks? Was it months? It doesn't really matter. What's important is it's something that I've been thinking about for quite a while, and I'm surprised, really, that nobody else out there is really having this conversation, probably because nobody actually cares, which is the topic of today's video, The Mandalorian versus Star Trek Picard. Not a fair comparison, you say? Well, tough because I think that there are more things connecting these two shows than most people probably realize, and I want to talk about it. So just sit down, get yourself a nice beverage, and just listen. Now, Star Wars and Star Trek have consistently, through the ages, been at odds with each other, at least from a fan perspective. It's very much like an us versus them mentality in a lot of different camps. And then, of course, you have the weirdos that like both franchises. But in my opinion, the argument between Star Trek and Star Wars has always been a little flawed. I think that, yes, both of them are large, major science fiction franchises, but Star Trek focuses much more on the science part of that phrase, whereas Star Wars focuses much more on the fiction side of that phrase, which is the more adventurous, kind of just whimsical side of that particular title of science fiction. And honestly, it's one of the reasons I think a lot of people felt that J.J. Abrams' 2009 Star Trek film felt a little too Star Wars-ish. It really focused up on the more fiction, fantasy, adventure elements of that particular story as opposed to being wrapped around the science aspect, which is what normally happens with a Star Trek production, which probably also leads most people to not have been really surprised when he got the gig to direct the very first sequel trilogy film, The Force Awakens, just a few years later. You know, I don't think it's a coincidence that J.J. Abrams was kind of at the start of the downfall of both of these franchises at the exact same kind of time. But, I don't know, to get more into that, I probably would need my tinfoil hat or something. It's the Illuminati. For the first part of this video series, I'm not going to be comparing the shows directly with one another. That's not what this video is about. So we're not going to be comparing who's got the better characters, who's got the better world building, who's got the better scripts, the least amount of plot holes, stuff like that. But of course, that does beg the question of, what the hell am I going to be talking about today? Well, I'll tell you. These two shows, as wildly different as they are, and they are wildly different, believe me, were created, in my opinion, with the exact same intent, the exact same desires, and the exact same intentional outcome by both studios who were funding them. I think it's important to note that I'm going to be speaking in a lot of generalities in this particular video and probably in my next video because this is based solely off of my observations of reviews, feedback, different social media interactions, things of that nature to kind of help gauge my observational standpoint about these shows. That is not to say that you as an individual don't have your own right to feel however you want to feel. So don't get all, I loved this and I hated that, blah, blah, blah. If you love something, great. If you hated something, also great. I am not a cop and I'm not here to try to convince you otherwise. This video is about my observations. Moving on! So you see, we live in a world right now where both franchises are in similarly hot water with their fandom. There seems to be some kind of uprising within those particular groups that have a general pushback to all of the new productions each of these studios is kind of pumping out right now. And of course, Star Trek, being the trendsetters that we are, kicked this whole thing off with the now infamous Kelvin Universe trilogy that came out a couple of years ago. The reaction to the Kelvin Universe was the first indication in a situation that I have now dubbed the three-faction rule. What are the three factions? Well, I'll tell you. Number one is legacy fans who hate these new ideas. Number two is legacy fans who love the new ideas. And number three are new fans who don't actually care either way, and they don't really have any of that major baggage. Yes, I'm aware that some people will fall in between all of these groups, but you understand my point. These are the larger groups that kind of consist in these conversations when it comes to fandoms and appreciating or disliking a property. And yes, the 3-faction rule can be applied to many different things, including video games and different remakes of those kinds of natures. Hell, even look at the franchise Doctor Who. They are also facing a similar divide within their own fandom. It's very, very common for people to be experiencing this nowadays. So, by the end of 2016 and Star Trek Beyond had been released, I would say that the groundwork for the 3-faction group within the Star Trek fandom had already begun to kind of take shape in what would impact Star Trek moving forward into the future, a la Star Trek Discovery. Only at the time, I don't think a lot of people really noticed it, but it was there. Let's jump over to what Star Wars was doing at that time. After recently acquiring the franchise of Star Wars from George Lucas and like the gazillion-dollar deal of the century, I'm confident that all of those CEOs were sitting around in their little conference room, just drooling at the mouth, thinking about how they were going to turn Star Wars into another financial juggernaut in comparison to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So, to that end, they started pumping out films, specifically the first one out of the gate, which was Star Wars The Force Awakens, directed by J.J. Abrams. In Disney's favor, The Force Awakens kind of appealed to 2 of the 3 factions I was talking about: the legacy loved it fans and the new fan base. Specifically, those new fan faction folks were really, really big for Disney. They hit it out of the park and helped gain that movie to over $1 billion. It was a phenomenal event for Disney. It was really great for them. And they were able to capitalize it and double down on the new fan faction by repeating that $1 billion success with Star Wars Rogue One just, like a year later. So that really, really worked out well for them in that moment. However, the life cycle of somebody in the new fan faction is relatively short-lived, because once you're there, you are quickly going to be regulated into one of the other 2 factions once you become a fan of the franchise. And in the case of Star Wars The Last Jedi, there weren't a whole lot of new fan faction members kind of jumping on board. Most people at that moment were either in the new Legacy Hated It or Legacy Loved It factions, and that did not bode well for The Last Jedi. Now, The Last Jedi certainly didn't make things any easier with their questionable narrative choices.
I'm ending all of this. The tree, the text, the Jedi. I'm gonna burn it down. Sacred Jedi text!
The division between the Loved It and Hate It groups dominated the conversation and eventually supposedly spilled out and impacted all other areas of Disney's Star Wars, including the new Star Wars theme park thing that they opened up and also the Han Solo Star Wars movie, both of which were supposedly financially impacted by this whole loved it, hated it faction mentality. And this undoubtedly left a lot of the Disney CEOs in a position of sitting there wondering to themselves, what do we do next? Now let's jump back to Star Trek. With the 3-faction situation simmering under the surface post Kelvin Universe trilogy, the arguably disastrous first season of Star Trek Discovery really served to divide those loved it and hate it legacy fan groups, but did add a small, however notable group to the new faction fans. So that was a bit of an interesting twist there. However, I think that the most important lesson that the executives over at CBS learned came from Star Trek Discovery Season 2, which is, very simply, fans were willing to change factions given the right environment. Most Trekkies that I talk to and that I know would agree that Star Trek Discovery Season 2 is better than Star Trek Discovery Season 1, with a few going as far as to say they weren't even fans of Discovery until the second season came out. So with the knowledge of faction swapping in mind, I believe that CBS and Disney put forth several different plans in an effort to try to grease the wheels to get people off of the Legacy Hated It faction and into the Legacy Loved It faction. Disney did this in several different ways. Undoubtedly, they worked with EA to ensure that they completely Star Wars Battlefront 2. They probably also tried to provide a bit more oversight into the development of Fallen Order, which was a smash hit and a success for the entire Star Wars franchise. They also announced the last season, the final wrap-up season of Star Wars The Clone Wars, which everybody loved that. And then they went ahead and smashed in their ace in the hole. And what was that? It is I, the Mandalorian! CBS similarly announced all new shows that were going to be put into production. They announced another film going to be done by Noah Hawley, new animated shows, new short treks, books, comics, all of those fun things. And then they launched off their ace in the hole, which was, of course, Star Trek Picard.
Jean-Luc Picard is back.
Both of these shows, in my opinion, had a very similar end goal in mind, with the implied intent of doing several key things. Both of these shows, in my opinion, were put out with the implied intent of greasing the wheels of faction swapping. Fans have been asking for years to get a Star Wars story set in that universe that's a little bit less space opera and a little bit more grounded in kind of a more personalized story. They've also been asking for years to understand more about the fan favorite character Boba Fett. And yes, The Mandalorian isn't Boba Fett, probably because, Disney didn't want to pay all those licensing fees to Lucas. But he is as close as you're going to get. He's a Mandalorian. He's got the helmet. It's pretty damn close. So these are the things that they were looking for in regards to a Star Wars show, and that's what they've been asking for, and that's what they got. Fans inside of Star Trek have been asking for a production set in a post-Nemesis timeline situation and some really cool, satisfying canon conclusions to some of their favorite characters, which again, also it appeared to be what Star Trek Picard was about. What was at stake for these shows here? Well, both shows, in my opinion, needed to be slam dunks for their viewers. Both shows needed to grease that faction swapping wheel and get people over from the hated it legacy to the loving, everything legacy. And of course, both shows needed to continue to prop up the streaming service that they were being released on. In the case of Mandalorian, that was Disney Plus. And for Star Trek Picard, that was CBS All Access / Prime Video, depending on your region. So now, here we are in April 2020 for sure. The shows have come and gone. They've been released. And I ask myself, okay, were these shows successful in their ultimate goals? And if so, who was the most successful and why? Well, when it comes to the streaming services, I would say that you have to kind of look at this in the proper context. Disney has one of the crown jewels of entertainment libraries. It's got Marvel, it's got all the classics, it's got all the original shows. It's really incomparable to other media libraries. So doing a direct comparison of Disney Plus subscribers to Viacom CBS All Access subscribers isn't really fair. So how can we kind of judge this? Well, it's kind of impossible to do without direct internal polling numbers about A, exactly how many subscribers they have, and B, understanding why those people subscribed and stay subscribed without, again, all that internal information. But we can glean, at least from the external side of it, which is that, for one, Viacom CBS All Access has indeed continued to beat out all of their subscriber projections, all the way leading up into February 2020, where they beat out their entire projection for the whole year of 2020 in the first 2 months. I do believe that because Star Trek Picard came out in that moment, that it probably helped out with that. Certainly didn't hurt, so it definitely helped out there. And then when you compare the release of Disney Plus with The Mandalorian being released at the exact same time, I think it's fair to assume that that show certainly assisted with people tuning in to find out new content, because that was one of the few shows that Disney Plus had on there that was original content that wasn't already recycled stuff from their classic library. So I think both shows definitely helped out their respective streaming services. Then we need to talk about the other two sets of criteria, and this is where things start to really diverge. So most of you know how I feel about Star Trek Picard. I do a lot of reviews. I did one for every single one of the friggin' episodes. So if you don't know, then you're not watching my videos. Shame on you. But ultimately, really what it comes down to is show's pretty good, but it's got some obvious issues. What most of you don't know is how I feel about The Mandalorian. And honestly, I think The Mandalorian is actually worse off than Star Trek Picard. I think, especially when you consider a lot of the script issues and major plot holes of that show. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of plot holes, some really bizarre, bad narrative choices from the main characters, a lot of things that don't really make a whole lot of sense. And let's be real, like 3 of those episodes of the first season were essentially the same exact recycled story script. Mandalorian arrives on the planet. He begrudgingly agrees to go on the adventure. Wacky space fight ensues. He leaves with Baby Yoda in tow. It's very, very basic, especially when you compare it to the much more convoluted and complex story of Star Trek Picard. However, I would venture a guess that most of the people who across all 3 of the factions already know and recognize these issues with The Mandalorian, and I'd also venture a guess that the majority of people don't actually care, myself included. People loved the freaking Mandalorian. It boosted up numbers for the new fan faction, and it did wonderworks for the whole greasing of the wheels of swapping over from the Legacy hated it to the Legacy loving it fans, including myself. After I was done watching The Mandalorian, I was genuinely excited for more Star Wars coming down the pipe from Disney. It did its job. It was super successful, and I jumped into the other faction almost immediately after the very first episode. Even when like hardcore hated Legacy fans kind of jumped on the bandwagon and tried to crap on it, a lot of the show's supporters shut that stuff down in many different areas across the internet. Take YouTuber Robot Head, for instance, who does great work. I really like his reviews and stuff like that. He tried to shit over The Mandalorian the way he shits over The Last Jedi in his videos. And based off of that like to dislike ratio and the comments from his own subscribers, he was viewed as being in the wrong. And a lot of people disagreed with his negative opinions about The Mandalorian, even though I think a lot of the issues he brought up in his video are some of the things that I didn't like. But it didn't really matter, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense. So why is this the case? Why do we as fans know full well that The Mandalorian kind of sucked in some regards, but yet we look past it all and fall in love with the show anyways? Why did that happen? And honestly, I could talk probably for hours as to why that really happened, and I probably will go over quite a bit of that in the second part of this video where I do more of a direct comparison between the actual shows. But it really kind of just boils down to a simple concept. It is a return to form for Star Wars. It is a simple, character-driven story wrapped inside of a wonderful nostalgia blanket. It's got friggin' cute, lovable Baby Yoda, which took the whole friggin' world by storm, and it's got badass characters doing badass things in the entire show. It really zeroizes that focus back into the fiction portion of the science fiction title. It allows the adventurous spirit of the show to kind of carry it, and not some convoluted plot about, I don't know, Palpatine's granddaughter or whatever.
Kill the girl. I never wanted you dead.
So is it safe to say that The Mandalorian succeeded in all 3 criteria? Yes, I would say that they succeeded. Well, what about Star Trek Picard then? Well, this show was almost entirely banking on the whole faction swapping concept. I think that if you were not a legacy fan of Star Trek, a lot of the stuff in this show probably went over your head. And I know that because a lot of people that I work with came up to me and said, what the hell is going on in this show? What does this mean? Who are these old people on this friggin' light in this log cabin? What is going on? So yeah, I think some of the things definitely went over some folks' heads. So this was really banking on that faction swapping piece, which means that this show needed to be a slam dunk with the viewers in order to enact the part of that whole plan of faction swapping. But was it a slam dunk? Sadly, not so much. Picard was mired by much more criticism and much less love than The Mandalorian was. While CBS did try to create their own simple character-driven story, they did some kind of weird strike-up deal between the science and the fiction elements of the science fiction concept. Wrapped up in a nostalgia blanket, it ultimately did not connect to legacy fans in the same way that The Mandalorian did for legacy Star Wars fans. But why is that? Well, Disney refocused The Mandalorian right back onto its core roots of being a fictional story, a fictional adventure story. All the while, CBS was trying to strike a middle ground between science and fiction with Star Trek Picard and attempted to kind of merge the two together into being something slightly unexpected, which I think ultimately didn't really pay off so well. CBS's reluctance to do straight up TNG 2.0 and going full nostalgia blanket was kind of a bold choice and may prove to be the right one long term. However, in the short term, I think that this is probably one of the reasons why this show is more criticized heavily than that of The Mandalorian. The Mandalorian embraced fully what it actually was, which is a simple adventure story purely for entertainment purposes only. That is what Star Wars really is at its essence, and that is what mainstream audience members expect to see from a Star Wars film, which is just adventure in general. Whereas Picard just tried to pay almost homage to the science portions of the previous Star Trek productions and still kind of dabbled a little bit in too much of the realm of JJ-verse kind of concepts that a lot of longtime legacy Trek fans view as the total antithesis of what Star Trek is supposed to be. Yes, they tried to go for more philosophical and less blow 'em up, shoot 'em up, but it still didn't quite nail that science nostalgia piece directly, which would essentially have turned its show into a TNG 2.0. Overall, I believe that Star Trek Picard did attract some new people into the new fan faction, and I do think that they did assist in bringing in some people that were in the Legacy Hate It group over into the Legacy Loved It group. But I ultimately don't think that it was as big of an impact as CBS and Viacom were really hoping for and really being that slam dunk that they were really, really wanting. So when I compare these shows together based off of these three criteria, which one of them succeeded more so than the other? And did they succeed really at all? I would say that it's safe to bet that both shows did succeed in what the original intent was for them to set out to do, which is, again, be a slam dunk for audience members, bring people over from the Hate It group into the Love It group, and prop up their streaming platforms. I think both shows did do that to differing degrees, with The Mandalorian being our clear winner for this particular comparison. So congratulations to The Mandalorian on that front. So now this leaves us to warp into the second portion of this video series, which is if both shows did ultimately succeed in their original intents, which show was executed better?